Hi, and welcome to This Is Fine, where we've been looking at how to deal with fear and anxiety in a time of great fear and anxiety. Last week we talked about in Exodus chapter 2 the difference between reacting and responding. Today we're going to be in Exodus chapter 3 and we're going to look at what it means to be available to God. Amaya Wellmaker from our youth group is going to have our reading, so we're going to kick it over to Amaya and then we'll get right back into it.
Okay, so I will be reading Exodus chapter 3, 1 through 6. So it says, Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he held the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within the bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see the strange sight, why the bush did not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called out to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God, your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this moment, Moses had hid his face because he was afraid to look at God.
Thanks, Amaya. So we read a fairly common section of scripture today from Exodus chapter 3 where Moses encounters God in the form of a burning bush. And so today, like I said, we're going to be talking about what it means to be available to God. And I think we see Moses doing this exact thing in a very perfect way. We know this word available to mean a lot of different things. But for me, what comes to mind most is this idea of availability being the greatest ability. That's actually a comment or a phrase that one of my favorite writers, sports writers, Ben Golliver, writes about. Availability is the greatest ability. And what I mean by that is that you could have the greatest, arm in baseball, you could have a great jump shot, even in business, you could be a great businessman or woman, you could be a great student. All that stuff is fantastic. But if you don't show up to competition or you don't show up to work or you don't show up to class to use the abilities you've been given, none of that matters, right? You could have the greatest abilities in the world, but if you don't show up and use them when it's ready to be used, they don't really matter. And so what I think Moses is showing us here is availability in the sense of not necessarily skills or attributes, but availability to God when God is present, right? He was in the right space and maybe the right even headspace to be available to God when God was calling him. And so the difference that I see mainly in Moses at this point is that his life is drastically different than what it used to be, right? He lived under Pharaoh's roof. We talked about that in a past video about how he lived in Pharaoh's house and he was definitely not welcome there, right? Pharaoh was actively trying to get rid of his people. And then he goes out and he's trying to be among his people and in turn kills an Egyptian in the process. And he's forced to run away. And like I've said in other videos, it's an extremely stressful life. He has nowhere to really be who he is called to be. And it's only when he escapes into the wilderness is he finally able to find respite, relaxation, and see and be available to what God is calling him to do. And now I think it's significant that, yes, Moses is available, but he wasn't really available when he was in Egypt. Right? We talked about this being a stressful situation. What he was surrounded with didn't cater to him being available to God's calling at that point in his life. It wasn't until he was in the wilderness in a setting where he could be available to God that he was then able to see God's presence and interact with him. And so there's a couple things that I want to take away from this and this idea of being available. Because we can read this and see how Moses acted, but if we don't take anything from it, we won't learn it ourselves. And so how can we be more available in our lives? And I wrote a couple notes down here that I want to share with you guys. How can we be more available? Number one, we need to make ourselves available. Make ourselves available. And this might sound like a simple point, but if we are not actively making ourselves available, it's not going to happen for ourselves. It's not going to happen on its own. And what I mean by that is that we might not be able to be like Moses and go off into this wilderness, right? And experience a completely radically different life, literally pick up and go to a different place kind of lifestyle. But we can manufacture a wilderness for ourselves, I do believe. And what I mean by that is going to a place that allows you to be alone with God. Maybe it's even inside your house. I know, like I said, we can't actually go places right now. I know it's kind of weird to say this, but maybe it's just changing your routine a little bit to where you can set yourself out of what you normally do and make a wilderness for you. Make yourself available to God. Maybe it's going into a different room than you normally, do your homework in or do your work in. Maybe it's going outside and spending time, under a tree or in your backyard. Go and make yourself available by changing your setting in order to be available to God. It makes a huge difference, right? I know for me, especially when I'm trying to do work, if I get stuck or I'm writing something and I get stuck, I have to get up and do something else or get up and change where I am in order to make myself think more clearly. It's the same thing with God. It's the same thing with making yourself available. It sometimes is as little as changing where you are to make yourself more available to God, because it's not just going to happen on its own. We have to be a part of this, of making ourselves available process. So number one, make yourself available. And number two, once we've made ourselves available, we need to be able to say what Moses said. Here I am. And I want to pause for a second and talk about the depth of what this means. Okay, this is actually a fairly common phrase through the Bible where people encounter God and their response is to say, here I am. I'm thinking about Isaiah, right? I'm thinking about this experience where he's in the throne room of God and he's terrified. And Moses was scared too. And their response was, here I am. And their lives were much, much different after. And I say this, it's kind of scary, right? To open yourself up and say, here I am. It's even scary to do this with another person, right? It's even scary to say to another person that you love, and say, this is who I am. Here I am. You've seen all of me. You've seen me in my, when I'm sad, when I'm mad, when I'm happy. Here I am. And when we open ourselves up to God, it takes vulnerability to say, here I am. Because what happens next, I don't know. But I do know that when Moses had that, disposition to be available and then said, here I am, his life changed. And yes, his life did get really difficult. He had to do a lot of hard things. But so much fruit came from his labors after this moment where he said, here I am. And I think the same thing can happen to us. When we make ourselves available and respond by saying, here I am, our lives will be drastically different in reflection of God. And it might not be easier. Most of the time when people say this, their life gets more difficult. But it's difficult in a way that God is leading you in a much more realistic and tangible way. So that's what I'm asking you to do. That's what I think Moses is kind of leading us to do. Make yourself available and say the words, here I am. Maybe you're saying this, in your own wilderness that you've created. But find that place and say those words and see what God does next. So I hope this was helpful for you guys. I'm excited to do a couple more videos. We're about done with this series. But if you have any questions, add them below. Email me. If you have any thoughts, please let me know. I'd love to hear from you guys. Thank you for the encouragement. And I hope that you guys are doing well. I miss seeing you guys in person, and I hope to be together soon. Thanks a lot.